And now I have to say, apologies in advance. This is a fairly bizarre way of addressing a group of people. I feel kind of like a villain in a 90s movie here. Like I should be telling you guys the riddle that you have to solve if you're going to find the bomb in time. Now, can everybody hear me okay? Do I need to change my volume at all?
Sounds
all
great.
right. Excellent. Okay, so I'm here to make a fairly easy point tonight, and I'm going to spend a lot of time making it because I think it's a super important one. And I apologize in advance because I'm used to expressing myself in 5 to 6 minute breathless bursts. I'm not used to long form communication here. And I'm also used to being able to go back and edit myself afterwards in case I find myself on a bizarre tangent that has nothing to do with anything that I can't quite reel myself back in for. So apologies in advance if I find myself in one of those situations. And just to make sure that we're not disturbed here, let me change my Skype status here. Sorry about that. Should have done that a second ago. So ultimately, the point that I hope to make here, the point that I hope to defend here today is the argument that ridicule, even pretty merciless ridicule, can be an effective means of positively influencing a person's opinion. Now, that's an idea that's really come under fire from a lot of atheists, a lot of people within the community that sort of that push back against that. And I think there are a lot of sound arguments in favor of it. But before we get into any of those, I want to kind of throw my biases out there in front. My name's Noah Lugeons. Do a podcast called The Scathing Atheist. It's one of several podcasts that I do. But essentially, if it turns out that I'm wrong and that ridicule has no place in the atheist movement, I'm out of a job, right? It's kind of what I do. So obviously, I have a vested interest in believing that what I say is true. I don't think that has affected my beliefs. But I do think it's important that we throw our biases out there right away. Obviously, I have a vested interest in being right here. Now, the argument that I'm going to make is not going to be that ridicule is the most effective way to change a person's mind. It can be in certain circumstances, but that's too hard of an argument to make. So I'm going to back away from that. What I'm really going to say is that it is a tool. And it is a useful tool, and like any other tool, if you use it incorrectly, you're not going to get the results you want out of it. I think we've all probably seen someone hammering away at a bolt at some point or another. Maybe a YouTube video of some atheist screaming at a street preacher about what an asshole he is. This is not effective use of ridicule. But it no more condemns the use of ridicule than watching somebody improperly use a hammer. Now, normally when we make these arguments, when we speak out in favor of, and I'm going to continuously use the word ridicule, I'll define my terms a little bit more later, but when we speak out in favor of ridicule, we're very often confronted with pushback from people who say, hey, look, it's fun, whatever, it's cathartic, whatever, we can all have a giggle about it, but it's been scientifically proven to be ineffective. Now, when we're talking about psychology, the word scientifically proven should always be taken with a grain of salt. But I feel like the arguments, the scientific data has been oversimplified, misinterpreted, and often misrepresented in this case, right? So what the scientific evidence actually shows, as near as I can determine, is that when you use ridicule, when you employ those types of tactics in argumentation, very often it's said that people are less receptive. What's actually measured here, as near as I can tell, is that people tend to recall less of what you said later, right? That's the measurement we're using for receptivity on this. And the cliche is that as soon as someone feels insulted or attacked, their wall goes up, they stop listening to what you're saying, they double down on their opinions. And very often that is true in the short term, very often it's true in the long term. But the idea that it is as I said, scientifically proven to be ineffective is completely overblown. The same thing is true, right? This same pushback effect is true if you use logic in your argument, right? There is an equally robust set of data that show as soon as you introduce logic, a lot of people put up that wall and stop listening to what you're saying. Now, we wouldn't use that evidence as a reason to stop using logic, right? The same is true of statistics. If you put statistics in your argument, very often people will later be able to recall less of what you've said. Again, that doesn't mean that there's a problem with statistics and that we shouldn't use statistics. It means that it is a tool that can be used both properly and improperly. And if you haven't gathered that what I was saying about rambling is true by now, I don't know what I can do to convince you. So before I really dive in to the argument that I want to make, I want to start by saying that God does not exist. You know, I say that because I like to start somewhere where we're unified, start on a point of agreement here. And another point of agreement that I think we can all get behind, especially those of us in Oklahoma, is that it can be very frustrating to be an atheist in America. Amen. Especially in November of 2016, more so than usual, but at any time, right? And I feel like a lot of the reason why it's so frustrating is that it feels like this is a battle that we've already won, right? Our arguments here are not just better, our arguments are sound. Our arguments are in many ways logically unassailable. It seems like, and I apologize in advance for the war metaphor, but it seems like we should be, there should be a few city blocks with a little bit of resistance that we still have to mop up. There are a couple of little islands that we have to subdue yet, but it seems like we should be not just winning by a little here, and yet we are still an overwhelming minority in this country. Now, obviously, I liken it to, to a company that has a product that they know is a good product. They know that this is a better product than the competition. It exists. For example, it works. It's less expensive. And yet we see Christianity sitting on the shelf and atheism sitting on the shelf, atheism collecting dust, Christianity flying off the shelf. And we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing wrong? Right? Obviously, it can't be the logical arguments. And I say that, and it may sound like I'm patting myself on the back a little bit here, but listen to like the best apologists out there, the William Lane Craigs of the world. Listen to the arguments that they're formulating. And what they're trying to do at this point is argue for some tangential, somewhat related thing. Doesn't really prove the thing that they're trying to say, but at least kind of proves that the thing that they're trying to say isn't a completely ridiculous thing that should just be thrown out altogether. Right? They're like 3 levels removed now from the thing that they're trying to prove. That's my evidence that we've won basically on the logical front. So of course, when we look at it in that product analogy, our instinct is to say, okay, must be the marketing, right? Our product is better. We know our product is better. So maybe it's the packaging. Maybe it's the slogan. Maybe it's the spokesman, right? So we ask a lot of those types of questions, and those are good questions to ask, right? This is a logical direction for us to go. The billions upon billions of dollars has been spent researching how best to influence people, how best to change people's minds, how best to try to get an outcome out of people by marketeers. Why would we not take advantage of this, right? So we tend to apply a lot of the marketing strategies to atheism. And like I said, that's a good thing. But we have to keep in mind that we don't have a product to sell, right? That changes the calculus quite a bit. When you're trying to sell a product, there are certain things that you do in your marketing. You try to convince people that your product is better than the other guy's product. You see people do that with atheism all the time, right? You see people try to convince them that, life is better off when you're an atheist than it is when you're religious. That's not the right way to go in this instance, and I'll get to why. But in advertising that's based on trying to get somebody to buy a product, you might see them talking about, how handy-dandy it is, et cetera. Or they might be creating problems, cooking spaghetti is so difficult. Look at all the things that you must carry. Our new product will save you all that trouble, right? And you see people doing that with atheism as well. You see people presenting problems to religious people that those people don't really have, and acting like atheism is going to solve those problems. So those are some of the problems that we bump into when we start treating atheism like a product. Like I said, and now again, I'm not saying we abandon marketing. I'm saying we look at what we're marketing and we look at it correctly, because there is such a thing as negative marketing. And when I say that, I don't mean, my opponent is a liar and a cheater and what about our emails? I mean advertising that is intended to create a negative result. right? We're not trying to get someone to do something. We're trying to get someone to not do something. So Christianity sits on the shelf, but it sits next to Hinduism and Islam and Judaism and all the other religions. Atheism is just not going into that store or not buying anything while you're there. And when you look at marketing tactics for those types of things, I think the easiest analogy that we can give to that is like public service announcements that are designed to get people to not do a thing. Quit smoking campaigns or just say no campaigns, those kind of things. Now, generally speaking, those are marketed in a very different way. They use a lot more logical argumentation, but they also use a lot more ridicule. They use a lot more public shame, right? If you're trying to sell Pepsi, you're probably not going to go out and say, oh, those people who drink Coke are a bunch of idiots, right? But if you're trying to sell not drinking soda at all, you might very well use that tactic, and marketing has proven it effective. Or at least it's proven it effective enough that they keep bumping their head against the wall there. Now, like I said, I know I'm butting up against a lot of what people believe to be, scientific evidence. And obviously, if there's any group of people that is going to be swayed by the scientific evidence, it's us. So I am going to pick that apart a little bit more and present some of the scientific evidence that sort of supports my opinion a little bit more. But before I do that, I'm going to dive into an anecdote. And I don't want to be the guy who says, ignore the science, listen to my personal story. But I do think that it'll be illustrative for some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about a little later on. Because I have two examples of when ridicule was used to change my mind. Both of them are coming out of religion stories. So if you'll forgive me the little personal diversion here. Like I would imagine many of you or most of you, I was born into a religious household. My parents were nominally religious. They weren't churchgoers. But if I asked where the universe came from, the answer was going to be God. Right. If I came to them and asked them about the logistical problems with Noah's Ark, they were going to try to patch those up. Right. They weren't going to say, oh, it's just a fable. Don't worry about it. If I asked about Jesus, I was going to hear that he loved me and he died for my sins, all of these things. But like most people, or at least like many people who are given religious explanations without being given religious indoctrination, it didn't really stick. Right. The logical problems were just a little too great. But one of the things that I did pick up on along the way is how uncomfortable my parents got when I asked questions about them. Right. So, my parents would always answer my questions. But if I kept going, if I kept digging, they got frustrated. And it became very clear that this was a subject that they did not want to talk about. So there was a certain amount of reverence that was attached to it. And as a kid, you pick up on that. You don't want to make your parents uncomfortable. Normally, I'm rewarded for asking questions. I'm rewarded for seeing the logical problems in things. In this instance, I wasn't being rewarded for that. So in many ways, I swallowed back my questions. And as a matter of fact, I didn't just swallow them back in the sense that I didn't ask them to my parents or to my siblings or to my peers, but I didn't even ask them to myself, right? Because I was taught that God can hear your thoughts. If you start doubting Jesus' existence, even in your own head, you can burn in hell for it. And look, when you're a kid, obviously that's super influential because you don't really know what's ridiculous quite yet. And so I'd love to say that, this all ended when I found my atheist influences. I started reading Bertrand Russell and Epicurus and Spinoza when I was a kid. And if I was a little more pretentious and a little less honest, that's exactly what I'd tell you. But in truth, the names that mattered more to me in coming to atheism were names like Douglas Adams, George Carlin, and Monty Python. Those things which ridiculed religion. Now, as a kid who was a little bit afraid to ask these questions, when I read Douglas Adams talking about God disappearing in a poof of logic, where I saw the kind of absolute irreverence that the Monty Python crew treated God with, or when I heard George Carlin talking about giving up on religion when he reached the age of reason, it suddenly gave me permission, at least in my own head, to ask these questions. Yeah, these guys weren't getting struck by lightning. So it allowed me the ability to actually dive into these things and say, well, maybe this is something that, because let's face it, it's pretty convenient for mom and dad that there's an invisible person that is going to send you to hell if you steal a Milky Way bar. So it's fairly easy to logic your way out of this as soon as you give yourself permission. Now, of course, you might ask yourself, does it matter that it was ridicule? right? Does it matter that these people were ridiculing religion? Did that have anything to do with in other words, if somebody had just walked up and presented those arguments to me and failed to get struck by lightning, would it have had the same effect? Well, there's two reasons that it did matter that it's ridicule. The first is accessibility, right? My parents weren't going to play a movie for me that just made an argument against the existence of God, but my dad recognized that Monty Python and the Holy Grail was pretty damn funny, so he rented it for me. Often truth can hide in humor in a way that it can't hide anywhere else. And the other thing too, and we'll get back to this a little bit more when we talk about the scientific evidence for the effectiveness of ridicule, is that people are more receptive when they're laughing. That's, again, fairly robust data set on that when you've got someone in a chuckly mood, they're far more likely to say, well, maybe the thing I'm thinking is a little more ridiculous than that. Now, of course, that's a pretty bad example, even for an anecdote, because we're not talking about a time when a person's mind was changed, right? Like, this was just a reinforcement of what I already believed. I already was tending towards atheism. All that this ridicule accomplished was giving me permission to go another step closer towards it, right? So I offer the second example, and this is another example of me coming out of religion, and this is the religion of neo-pagan woo, which is where I fell almost immediately when I got out of my parents' Christianity. And the real reason is because, the religious people kept telling me, all the religious people in my life, don't look over here. You sure won't find the truth in all this paganism and stuff. So, of course, when I got out, that's the first place I looked. And I don't know how much you know about neo-paganism, but it has everything that a 14-year-old boy looks for in religion. It's got boobs. That's pretty much it. So, but like, there's a lot of nudity and sex rights and things like that in it, and obviously that's way more appealing than let's go all sit at church and talk about abstinence together. So I got into that, and I got really heavily into it. Right, I had a library of books on tarot reading and low magic and high magic and all this other nonsense. I had the complete works of Aleister Crowley and Israel Regardie and Raymond Buckland and all of this, just tons of nonsense, tons of mental energy that I probably should have spent on anything else. And for those of you who have ever read any of these books, they kind of fall into three categories, right? One is so intentionally obfuscating that they obviously have nothing to say and just don't want to admit it, right? The second is these books that they sort of define this magic down to nothing so that they can make sense, so that you can do a magic spell, but there's no way to tell if it worked. And so you can kind of convince yourself that they're real. And the others are the most ridiculous shit you can possibly imagine, and you just can't believe anyone takes them seriously. And those, by the way, are the majority. So as I'm collecting my library of woo books, I come across a lot of these things that just, no matter how motivated I am in my reasoning, I cannot make myself believe that these aren't bullshit. So I developed this gradient of bullshit. Now, of course, when you're in woo, there's no line of demarcation, right? There's no point at which woo ends and reality begins. So virtually everyone in the woo world has some form of woo that they'll look at, and go, oh, come on, that's silly. Right, so I did that. I was like, oh, Bigfoot, come on, give me a break. Oh, astrology, psh. Oh, tarot cards, now that shit, there's something going on there, right? That was my personal sacred cow, for lack of a better term. And not because, by the way, not because I really believed in tarot or anything, but because I had a few experiences reading tarot, right, where people would say to me, there's no way you could have known that, or that's the most amazing thing I've ever, and even if it didn't seem amazing to me, it seemed so amazing to the people I was reading tarot for that I managed to convince myself there was something to it. And I wanted, again, motivated reasoning, I absolutely wanted it to be true, because this was the only thing that I could really cling to and say, yes, there is a spiritual world. Yes, there is a supernatural. Yes, my spirit will live on after I die, right? So this was something that I really wanted. I didn't really want tarot to be magical so much as I really wanted, some connection to the divine, or some evidence that the divine was a thing. And that lasted for a good 10 or 12 years until my wife bought me an iPod and I got into podcasting. I got into listening to podcasts, I should say. And of course, I thought, hey, I can make myself smarter here. So I went to a number of academic subjects and just subscribed to the top podcast in each subject. And the top science podcast at that time was the Skeptics Guide to the Universe. And thank goodness it was, or God only knows what I'd be doing with my life right now, but it wouldn't be as fun. Now, this is a show, of course, if you're not familiar with it, well, you really should be familiar with it. It's a phenomenally good podcast. And immediately when I started listening to it, they were making fun of the exact same things that I like to make fun of. They were making fun of astrology, and they were making fun of psychics that talk to crystals and all of this nonsense. And I laughed along with them, and I really enjoyed the show. And then eventually they talked about cold reading and tarot cards, and I was not happy. Right? Like all of a sudden the joke was on me. I was the butt of the joke and it was no fun. And I experienced that thing where like the wall goes up, right? Where I pull out my iPod and I say, to hell with you guys. I'm not listening to you anymore. You don't know what the hell you're talking about. I am absolutely certain beyond the shadow of a doubt that I'm right and that you're wrong. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to get on this here computer and I'm going to find the evidence to prove that you're wrong. And I'm going to send it to you because you seem like reasonable people. And once you see the data that I've seen, as soon as I find that data that shows that I'm correct, that I'm sure is here. Maybe it's on Bing. You know what? I bet it's on. I gotta have to Bing this. Shit. Is Ask Jeeves still a thing? And eventually, I look there and I'm looking up and I'm like, holy shit. The only thing that agrees with me is InfoWars. Wow. So in many ways, because I was motivated by the ridicule, because I found myself to be the butt of the jokes that I was laughing along to until just a few minutes ago, I sort of forced myself to re-examine my opinions. Now, there are a couple of key important factors that we'll come back to and why this was effective, but I bring these two examples up because they show you the two ways that ridicule tends to work. The first is that it forces people to re-examine their opinions. And the second is it gives people permission to challenge those opinions. Now, again, those are both anecdotes. I don't expect you to discard any scientific evidence based on them. But there is some scientific evidence that suggests this might be right after all. Like I said, yes, people are less receptive if they feel attacked. Yes, people are less receptive if they feel insulted. But when it comes right down to it, as near as I can tell, and I'm pretty sure I'm right on this one, you can feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but the most effective way that we've found in terms of changing people's opinions, and this isn't their opinion on which is better between Coke and Pepsi or whether you should go for two or kick the PAT, the most effective way of changing people's opinions on fundamental core beliefs is social pressure, right? And as a matter of fact, I don't believe that this is controversial at all within the social sciences. As a matter of fact, let's go to another anecdote, but this time rather than my anecdote, I want it to be your anecdote. You can probably remember a time in your life where you changed your mind on a firmly held belief. Right now, I'm not talking about necessarily religion. Right? I'm talking about a belief that you were firm enough about that you would have argued with somebody about it, right? Like that you would have defended that position in a one-on-one argument. Now, if you can think of something like that you eventually changed your mind on, I want you to ask yourself when you changed your mind, right? For me, the easiest example is abortion. I grew up in a super conservative household. I was taught that abortion was baby murder. I'm imagining several of you were too. And it was a very limited community because I lived in a really rural area in South Georgia where that was constantly reinforced. The people that my parents associated with and brought over to the house all seemed to agree. And then I went to college and I was exposed for the first time not just to the arguments in favor of abortion, right? Because obviously those weren't making it into my house. And if they did, we would have just ridiculed them. But I was also, for the first time, introduced to the social pressure to not express my opinion on it, right? For me, it came in the form of I'm sitting around with 4 or 5 people and somebody makes a joke where the people who are against abortion are the butt of the joke. And I learned that maybe I shouldn't mention that opinion around these people. And it wasn't just that I was browbeat into submission. It's that I started to really re-examine my opinion. And I re-examined my opinion because it had been ridiculed. Now, again, there's something that links all of these various things, right? Douglas Adams, Skeptics Guide to the Universe, all my friends at college, and that is that I respected these people, right? This is why the guy who runs up to the street preacher and starts yelling at him about what an asshole he is on YouTube is so ineffective, right? Because that person doesn't have the respect of the person that they're ridiculing. And that's super important. We're going to get to that a little bit later. But to sort of dive into this social pressure issue, I want to take you guys back to when I was young, and no offense to anybody, but it looks like many of you are about my age. And you might remember back in late 80s, early 90s, you go into a McDonald's, right? And you take the seat right next to the McDonald's play place with the ball pit and the slides and everything for the kids. And sitting on your table is a little tinfoil ashtray in case you want a cigarette while you're in the McDonald's, right? That's hard to even believe now that used to be a thing, that you could just smoke in the Burger King or whatever. The social pressure changed so much on that it would be unacceptable. Now, of course, obviously at this point, the laws have changed. But when those ashtrays first started to disappear, there was no law telling anybody that they couldn't smoke in a restaurant. These were primarily things that the restaurants were doing as a way of bending to social pressure. That's a pretty poor example, though, because obviously there were a ton of different things, a ton of different anti-smoking campaigns that all sort of accumulated in the 90s. So let's take a look at instead another great historical example is racism. Right now, obviously, we still have plenty of problems with racism in this country. It's not a problem that we've solved by any stretch of anybody's imagination. But the way that we tackle it as a society now is very different than it was 50, 60, 100 years ago, right? If you were the anti-racist and someone made a racial slur or said something that was extraordinarily racist 50, 60 years ago, your most likely recourse would be to take them to the side and say, hey, I respect your opinions and I understand where they come from, but here's, some other facts that you might want to consider. Whereas today, we would shame that person. We would ridicule that person. If, say, a popular side character on Seinfeld was to go to a comedy club and yell out a bunch of racial epithets to some hecklers, right? Our response would not be to take him to the side and say, hey, man, I think you might just have this wrong, and let's really re-examine these opinions of yours. It would be to publicly ridicule and mock him, right? And you could argue that that's not a good thing. You could argue that there are better ways or more effective ways that we can do it, but you can't argue that it's not effective at all. I recall seeing a KKK rally one time, and of course, in these rallies, as any of you know, if you've ever been to an atheist rally, they'll have a little section set aside for the protesters. And the protesters in this particular instance, it's about 2-3 dozen people that are simply laughing at the guy on stage, right? They're not getting outraged when he calls them animals and subhumans and everything. They're just laughing at him. And I can't imagine a more effective way of countering that message, right? If they got angry along with him, they'd be playing into exactly what he wants. But if you just laugh at him, I mean, look, if you're out in public dressed as an albino Pac-Man ghost, it doesn't take a lot of help to be ashamed of yourself, right? So, and obviously what this all comes back to is ridiculing well. Right. Again, I come back to this guy on YouTube because this video is shared with me constantly. I don't know if you've seen the video, the specific video I'm talking about, which eventually turned out to be a staged video of a religious person trying to show what assholes atheists are by pretending to be an atheist and putting a video on YouTube, whatever it is. But it's important that we ridicule well. And I think that the reason why so many people are so inclined to say, let's just put that tool aside is because they've seen it used so poorly. Right now, again, I ridicule for a living, so I'd like to think of myself as something of an expert on it. But when I choose to use that, and again, it's always a matter of timing, right? So to go back to the tool analogy, it's not the tool for every job. If you're having a one-on-one conversation with somebody where you're trying to change their mind about something, ridiculing that person individually, or even the idea that you're trying to change their mind on, is probably not the best way to go, right? So obviously it's going to be dependent on your goals. It's going to be dependent on your setting. It's going to be dependent on your audience. But again, if you take that tool out of your toolkit altogether, there's nothing to be gained from that whatsoever. What you need to do is learn to hone that tool. And you know what? I'm going to back away from that just a little bit, and I apologize. I'm getting into one of those rambly moments again. But I'm not going to say that you should have that tool in your toolkit because it's not for everybody. For some people, people, that's just not going to ever be an effective way. They're going to get frustrated and angry, or they're just going to piss people off, or it doesn't come naturally to them. And for those people, look, it's not going to be the most effective strategy for you, and it may never be, and there may never be any reason for you to hone that skill. I'm not necessarily saying that you should use ridicule so much as that you should support the people in the atheist community that do, whether that's at patreon.com/scathingatheist or wherever you can go to support those particular folks, because it is, in so many ways, it's effective if it's done right. Again, it's not only because people are more receptive to it in the sense that, like, if it's funny, people are more receptive to the idea that's being presented, but also it reinforces community within atheism. Now, obviously, that leads us to some in-group, out-group problems. So there's obviously a whole can of worms there. And ridicule is one of those strategies that is most effective at creating in-group, out-group issues, and we have to be super conscious of that when we're employing this tactic. But I would argue that there's never a situation where it cannot be used. There's just a situation where it's more or less difficult to use it effectively. For example, if you're ridiculing an idea, that will always be easier than ridiculing a person. That's not to say that you should never ridicule a person, right? For example, I spend an awful lot of time ridiculing Pat Robertson. Now, if I was talking to Pat Robertson and I was trying to change Pat Robertson's mind, I probably wouldn't ridicule him. But if I'm trying to change the minds of people like Pat Robertson, he might be a great stand-in. If I'm trying to change my dad's mind, and I am trying to change my dad's mind about a lot of different things, he shares a lot of opinions with Glenn Beck. But there are also some really ridiculous opinions that Glenn Beck has that my dad and I can laugh about. So if I start off by ridiculing Glenn Beck and his silly opinions, my dad and I can, we can have that conversation and have it comfortably for quite a while before suddenly I'm ridiculing his opinions that he shares with Glenn Beck, and he sort of has to laugh along, right? In other words, I'm able to get deeper into a conversation than I otherwise would have been in because we're just having fun. At least I'm having fun, and he thinks he's having fun at the beginning. So like I said, and beyond that, of course, obviously building community within is a big deal. That's the whole purpose of our show, is just for us to all get together and laugh about how silly this is. It can be cathartic, and more than anything, it can remind people that they're sane. We get emails constantly from people who say, I live in the most podunk, rural Christian Bible Belt city that you can imagine. It's so nice to hear sanity once or twice a week, so that I can remember that I'm not the last sane person on the earth, on the planet. Also, it tends to be more memorable. And when I'm sorry about that, I had a crazy scroll issue there. But it can be a lot more memorable when we're talking amongst ourselves. Funny is a little more memorable than facty, generally speaking. But the most important benefit of ridicule, and I apologize if it seems like I'm jumping around here a little bit at the end, is simply the intellectual honesty of it, right? The correct response to the ridiculous is ridicule. It's right there in the word. And when you look at the precepts of Christianity or of Islam or of any of the world's major religions, every one of them is not just incorrect, but ridiculously incorrect, right? They were absolutely more ridiculous than Bigfoot. They're more ridiculous than the people who think that they've been kidnapped by aliens. They're more ridiculous than homeopathy. By necessity, there's just simply more ridiculous things that you're piling on to get to a religion than you are to get to one type of woo, right? If you're willing to ridicule those things and you want to be intellectually honest, you have to be willing to ridicule religion as well. Otherwise, you're guilty of putting religion on a pedestal. You're guilty of saying that this is a thing that needs to be treated differently. Now, you may believe that it needs to be treated differently just because there's so many people out there that believe it. Maybe you feel like we just need to tiptoe our way into it a little bit more so than we do with the alien abduction nut jobs or what have you. But you can't argue that it's intellectually honest. Right? Now, I'm not saying that you can't be intellectually honest if you're not going to ridicule people. Some people just don't like to do that, and they don't ridicule anybody about anything, and that's fine. You know, that's you, and power to you, whatever you find to be effective for yourself. You know, I'm going to support you in that. But if you're the kind of person that'll laugh and point when he sees the Loch Ness Monster true believer, then you should be laughing and pointing when you see the hardcore Catholic with the little ash smudge on their face, right? We want to respect people, yes, absolutely, except for Pat Robertson, but we don't want to respect ideas if those ideas do not merit respect. There is an antidote to reverence, and that antidote is irreverence. And that's the end of my notes, guys. Thanks so much.
Awesome presentation, sir.
Thank you.
That was well thought out, and it was a different Noah Lugeons than we get from the Scathing Atheist. So I wanted to thank you for that. It was awesome.
Oh, well, you bet. Like I said, I'm a little bit more used to a 5-minute burst than a 35-minute, 40-minute talk there. So I apologize if I got a little rambly and didn't have quite as much humor as I normally do, but a little bit tougher to do at that pace.
Speaking of your rambling rants, which everybody in here, I'm hoping everybody gets a chance to listen to the Scathing Atheist and enjoy your diatribes. Your diatribes are awesome. And there was one that you did back in November of last year after the attacks in Paris. And you almost, spelled out how Trump's came to power because the fact that, you talked in that particular diatribe about how if you have two sets of people, one that doesn't recognize the problem, and then somebody else who recognizes the problem but gets the solution wrong, and it's like, yeah, that's a description of why we have Trump right now. It's because the Democrats seem not to realize that, oh yeah, this is a problem with the Muslim or with the Islamic belief, and you pointed that out very well in that particular speech. And I have to laugh, though, at the very last, then you turned around and you were talking with Heath, and you had said that Trump's not going to, he's just a diversion in the Republican Party, and oh my God, I wish he was just a diversion in the Republican Party.
You know, that's one of the frustrating things about being a podcaster is that everything that you say, or a lot of the things that you say, are on record, right? So you can go back and hear me say, oh, there's no way he'll get the nomination. Are you kidding me? There's not a chance in hell. Once the real voting starts, and then, yeah, you can hear me for a solid 9-10 months saying there's no way he's going to win the election. I'm hesitant to say anything else. There's no way he's going to do, you know. There's no way he's going to resign along with Pence on his first day.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm going to step out of this chair and let the rest of these people come up here and ask you questions. So thank you so
excellent.
much.
Quite welcome.
Hey, nice to talk to you in your glorious hair. Like he said, your diatribes are phenomenal. So glad that you lay them down in print. It's a book that I'm getting for a friend of mine as a gift this year. I love your podcast. I love what you guys are doing. I appreciate so much that you have your podcast for us, for our community, formatted the way it is, that it's not a debate show. It's not a news show. It's a comedy show. It's there to have fun and keep us thinking. Do you find that you have any subscribers that are coming from anywhere other than the atheist community?
Not really. Once in a while, I hear from a religious person that listens to the show, which I find bizarre. But I do think that there are a lot of people who are religious who hate the super conservative, ultra religious wing of their belief, at least as much as I do. So I think, there are at least a few religious people who can sit back and laugh with me at the extremists, like the Pat Robertsons, et cetera. But by and large, I'd say no. I think since we started doing god-awful movies, I think that show appeals a little bit more to people outside of atheism, people who are nominally religious. And we might be moving a few of the audience members from there to Scathing Atheist. But I would say probably something like 99% plus is still coming out of the atheist community.
Yeah. And I mean, I really agree with what you're saying about needing to have all of the tools in our arsenal. I know for me, my dad's a pastor, and getting out of religion, the ridicule and the being able to laugh at myself and laugh at the things that I believed was a big part of how I was able to make that transition, out of that mindset. So I think that it had a bigger impact on me, than any of the intellectual arguments. Just being able to have that permission, to look at something and be like, this is absolutely ridiculous. This is absolutely stupid. These guys are totally right to make fun of it.
Right. The important thing to keep in mind is that the logical arguments are, like I said, they're logically sound. They're not just good arguments, they're sound arguments. But in order for them to be effective, we have to bring people to the point where they're receptive to those arguments. And, like I said, it's going to, different things work for different people. I know that there are people that, if they feel ridiculed or if they feel attacked, then you've probably taken a step back with them. But that's by no means universal.
My next question is, do you guys have any more live shows, tours, stuff like that planned?
Absolutely. Yeah, we've got a couple of shows planned already. We're trying to do at least 6 locations. I think the closest we're going to be to you, we're hoping to be in Austin in late in 2017, I believe either August or September. But we're going to be in North Carolina for ReasonCon in April. We're going to be, I believe, in January. We're going to be in Chicago doing a live show with Tom and Cecil from Cognitive Dissonance. That should be a lot of fun. We've also got one in the works in Seattle, and I believe one in Denver, but a lot of that's still up in the air.
He's coming around.
Okay.
Decide to take the long way?
I can do a little juggling or something in the meantime if you'd like. I could show off my buddy Christ there. Boy, is that loud. You guys have the most fantastic hair here.
Yeah. Love it. So it can be a complex thing to know when someone's receptive to it, and it's very contextual. And I don't know if you can maybe talk more about it or your experiences personally where it didn't work out and why it didn't work out.
Yeah, I think, like I said, I think the most important factor is respect, right? Do you have the respect of the person whose mind you're trying to change? And I think that one of the easiest ways to develop that, obviously, is to show yourself to be receptive. To be receptive to their ideas, to be receptive to their arguments, even if you're not really receptive to them, even if you've heard this argument 1,000 times before. And I think that's really where a lot of atheists go wrong in this, is that we've heard the argument so many times that before they've even articulated it, we're already, no, and I'll tell you why. So even if you have to feign that receptivity a little bit, I think that helps you out a ton. But I also think that obviously the audience context is so important, right? So more often, ridicule is going to be an effective way to change the mind of the person you're not talking to. Again, if you're on a debate stage would be an obvious example, but if you're on a Facebook thread where somebody has thrown out a poisonous or obviously wrong idea and you want to argue with them, you may not be changing their mind, and you may be making it harder to change their mind if you ridicule that idea, but you may also be influencing the hell out of the other people on that thread. So again, I think it comes down to asking yourself, what are my goals and who is my audience? more than anything else. Beyond that, I just feel like, just if they're not laughing even when you're really funny, it's probably not working.
Okay. Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, you bet. And the guy with the next shortest hair, I guess, if we're keeping it consistent there.
Hi, Noah. It's awesome to be able to talk to you. I'm a big fan of all your shows. I've been a patron donor for God Awful Movies since it started, and
Thank you.
watch the movies along with you guys too. And I'm not at all bitter that that's the only show where you don't thank your patrons by name. Anyway, yeah, I thought what you said about you weren't brought into the atheist movement by reading big, heavy, weighty arguments from more intellectual people was interesting, because that's kind of the same way that I came around to atheism, from mostly listening to stand-up comedians like Patton Oswalt, and I think you mentioned on your show actually his Sky Cake.
One of my all-time favorite stand-up routines. Yeah.
Yeah. But I wanted to ask you about I just recently saw a Pathos article that I shared on Facebook about Ken Ham's Twitter rant about millions of dollars being wasted on evolution. And I posted it, and I invited I think, this guy's an idiot, and I'd like anyone who thinks that creationism should be taught in schools or that evolution shouldn't to tell me why, because I can't imagine what your argument might be. And my sister and a couple other people responded, but the one thing that really kind of frustrated me was my old pastor from Kansas came back at me with the fine-tuning argument, which for people who aren't familiar is that the physical constants of the universe fall within such a narrow range that it necessitates a creator. And I tried to explain to him that really the odds for that are only astronomical if you assume that the purpose of the universe is to create human life. And he wasn't having any of that. So how do you respond to people with that kind of argument?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really difficult one, because I honestly think that might be the best argument left in the religious arsenal. And I really do think that that's a testament to how good we're doing with our arguments, that's the best that they can really do. I think Sean Carroll has a new book called The Big Picture, where he really tackles that, has a really good, thorough takedown of that whole argument. And one of the things that he really focuses in on is the fact that it's really, if you think about it, it's just a God of the gaps argument, right? It's yet another God of the gaps argument, because for all we know, there are underlying physics that inform the speed of light, that inform the weight of the neutrino, that, all these various things that I like to point to. And we simply don't know what they are. There may be a reason why these relationships have to be so, and if we eventually find that out, right, will they give up their belief in God? So very often when I'm presented with one of these kind of arguments, that's my go-to is, okay, so if we find out that you're wrong later, do you stop believing in God? And most often, of course, their answer, if they're being intellectually honest, is no. And then I say, I guess there's no point in this argument then, is there? And that's not to say there's no point in continuing this discussion with you, but there's no point in responding to this argument, right? You're presenting it to support your position, even though if it went the other way, you wouldn't change your mind. I hope that's helpful. Now, I mean, obviously, I'm digging into the specific argument more than sort of your general question on how do you handle people who simply don't want to listen to the arguments that you're making. And in those instances, I really do think that's where ridicule is the best tool in your arsenal, especially on something like a Facebook page where, okay, well, if you're not receptive to arguments anymore, then there's nothing that can really be gained by trying to argue with you, but there could be something gained by making an example of you for the other people who are still kind of curious and who are still receptive.
Awesome. Thanks. I'm a really big fan again, and tell Noah or Heath and Eli I say hi.
Will do.
Everybody's making a big lap.
Well,
Yeah.
I got the shortest hair, so, you know.
Oh, well, there you go.
Well, anyway, I just discovered you a couple weeks ago, and I'm up to, like, Did Jesus Masturbate? So you guys are cracking me up. It's outstanding, and, you know, you don't sound like your voice. You know what I mean? You got that Jeff Tate thing going on. That's...
I often have to apologize for not being overweight and bald. For whatever reason, I sound both of those things. Yeah.
Yeah, but you got that Jeff Tate Queensryche thing going on, so it's awesome. I dated myself there, so.
Yeah. Right.
There again, I just discovered you, listened to some of your past podcasts. Who are some of your atheists that you look up to, not necessarily idolize, but want to model yourself after, or, you know, look at like, yeah, you guys got it? Because I've been listening to, you said Ridicule, so I thought of like AIU and some of those guys. But, you know, who do you look up to?
Honestly, if the closest I have to an idol, I guess, in the world of atheism, and I guess that's not necessarily what he's best known for, but I would say George Carlin. If there's one person who I think is like the person that I would most like to pattern myself after, now obviously what I do is quite a bit different than what he does. But one thing that being an atheist over a long period of time tells you or teaches you is not to idolize anyone. They will all disappoint you eventually. So, you know, obviously, if you had asked me that question, I think 3 or 4 years ago, I probably would have had a much different answer. George is dead, so he can't disappoint me. You know, there's nothing offensive that I'm going to find on his Twitter that I have to defend. So, but I would say, you know, and from a purely an intellectual perspective, I would say a big fan of Matt Dillahunty and the work that he does. I think he and I see eye to eye on a lot of things, although I think we could have a really, really fun argument on the definition of the word agnostic and whether or not an agnostic atheist is a real thing. And also, I'm a big fan of David Silverman's work. I've had a chance to meet him on a couple of occasions now. I'm super impressed with the guy. And, you know, I think he's definitely one of those take it to them, ridicule them, you know, be a thorn in their side types of atheists. I really like the kick he's been on lately, trying to encourage more and more people to embrace the label of atheism. Yeah, I've got nothing but good to say about that guy at this point as well.
Right on. Well, I appreciate you, and keep up the good humor, because you got me. So.
Thanks a ton, man. Thanks.
Well, now I have to slide back in here. You brought up the subject of agnostic atheism, which this is actually a kind of funny joke with our group, because I did a speech not too long ago called "What Do You Know?" and I actually was interested in that particular subject, and I classify myself as an agnostic atheist, and I actually think there is some value in doing that. In fact, I actually think there's some value when you talk to a Christian, asking them the question, are you Gnostic or agnostic about your Christian beliefs? And it's kind of like a lot of them hadn't thought about that and hadn't given it much thought. And I like to present my argument as a little bit more nuanced. And I'm not a big fan of the Dawkins scale because I don't think it's all linear. I think there's a separation out of belief. And I've had that discussion with Matt Dillahunty too. It was actually kind of a fun, and that's what also started my "What Do You Know" speech. So.
Oh, right on. Well, now I will say, you know, I think if I'm debating with somebody who is a believer, right? If I'm debating with an atheist, I can debate all day about the agnostic atheist label. But I definitely agree that for the purposes of debate, it certainly puts you in a much, much stronger position if you're gonna defend, you know, agnostic atheism. The main issue that I take with it is that I'm an agnostic everything. You know, there is nothing that I believe to the point where no amount of evidence would change my mind. You know, I'm agnostic about gravity in the same way that I'm agnostic about God. And so I feel like very often that's taken by religious people as saying, well, you're not certain, you're not sure. So I think, very much like ridicule, I think it's a tool that can be used correctly in the right time. But I do think that when the chips are down and you're trying to really, really boil down what the term means, agnostic atheist is a little bit repetitive. Again, in the sense that if you're using logic correctly, you should be agnostic about all things except for perhaps your own existence. And I think there's even an argument that can be made against that one. So,
excellent. Yeah, I agree with you on a lot of that. Like I say, I still saw some value in the title Agnostic Atheist. And from the argument point, I see exactly what, I mean, it's a much easier case to make when you don't. I think the instance you say you're a Gnostic atheist or that you know something, you've taken on a burden of proof that I don't think we want to have in those arguments. So yes, absolutely agree with you on that one. So cool.
Yeah.
Next.
The only smart man in the group. I wasn't sure. Yeah. Okay.
First of all, big fan, just like everyone else here, I guess. And I got
thank you.
A couple quick questions for you. First of all, I'm going to be appearing on Angry Black Rant and a couple different podcasts here soon. Any advice?
Yes. If you can, without feeling too silly, sit there and talk to yourself for a little while. I honestly, when I first started podcasting, I felt like an idiot sitting in a room by myself talking and sort of like walking myself through an interview or something like that. And now it's just become a supernatural thing. Supernatural. No, it's become an extremely natural thing. Words mean things. I guess I got to be careful with that. And also, Ishmael's just a phenomenally funny guy, and he'll do you right. But just in general, I try to go when I'm doing a guest appearance on a pod, try to make sure that I'm not going in there with an agenda or a list of I'm going to say these things. Obviously you want to let the conversation happen. So that, I guess that's the best advice. I would say go in with a list of things that you want to say, but don't be married to it.
Okay. Yeah, it's great advice, and I appreciate it. It's probably going to be more along the lines of a debate on the value of Satanism within atheism.
Okay.
Since I'm a member of the Satanic Temple, and he's a little bit unsure of the whole concept. Mm-hmm. So should be a good conversation. I greatly appreciate your advice. Also, I wouldn't be where I am if it wasn't for your podcast and for you all criticizing religion as much as you do. Not that your opinion needs validation, but you certainly have it.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I look forward to hearing that. I'm very interested in the Satanic Temple and the work that they do. Generally speaking, I most of what I've heard of, I support wholeheartedly. So I'm interested to hear what Ishmael's reservations are.
Yeah, it should be a good conversation.
Anybody else?
All right, one more question.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up having to watch those fucking movies. How the fuck do you not kill yourself going through that every week?
There are movies. Okay, so like the one that we did this past week, the one that just came out today, the King's Faith, was just so, Heath described it as aggressively mediocre. I thought that was the best possible way you could sum up that movie, and that was absolutely no fun. But once in a while you find a gem. The movie that we're doing for next week's show, we've actually already recorded it so we could take the holiday weekend off, is a movie called Blood Freak. It's a mutant turkey Christian slasher flick. I know, another mutant turkey Christian slasher flick. But it's probably the most, yeah, exactly. Probably the most incredible movie I've ever seen in my life, and I could watch it 16 times in a row. So, I've always really loved bad movies. But I will say watching these movies is definitely the hardest part of my job. But it's absolutely worth it to get to sit next to Eli and Heath as they rip into him later. So.
All right, thanks.
Well, thank you again for your time. Really appreciate you doing this for us, and thank you very much. And I want to stay in touch with you and continue to I will continue to enjoy your shows. Your diatribes are awesome. I recommend them to all my atheist friends because so many times there's something in the news that you just peeved you out, and then I got to go and listen to you spell out exactly why I'm. Yeah, and sometimes it's nice to hear it. It's cathartic. So
well, thank you very much. I will say, just on that note, on election day, there was an incredible burden on me as I realized that there were people around the world that were expecting me to somehow put that kind of frustration into words. So very much appreciate it. Really appreciate the invite. It was a lot of fun. I hope I didn't ramble too much for you guys.
No, you were awesome, man.
All right, excellent.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll talk to you later.
All right, take care, guys.